we are ready to talk. However, we live in a world where voices and images.
This is very valuable to us, and we will.
Stop scrolling for a second, because what just unfolded in that courtroom has people across the country asking questions no one expected to ask this soon. A nationally recognized television anchor, an 84-year-old mother who vanished from her own home.
The light is missing from our lives. Nancy is our mother. We are her children.
A disappearance that was supposed to be a controlled investigation. And suddenly a courtroom filled with tension, reporters leaning forward, and new details surfacing that make the story feel far more complicated than anyone first believed.
She is our beacon. She holds fast to joy in all of life's circumstances.
Let me ask you something. If this was simply a missing person investigation moving through the normal process, why did sealed evidence suddenly become the center of a heated courtroom exchange? Why did attorneys begin debating the exact sequence of how items were logged and when certain findings were documented? And why did one legal observer quietly remark that the conversation happening inside that room could change the public understanding of this entire case?
This is very valuable to us, and we will pay.
Because up until this moment, the story surrounding Nancy Guthrie followed a pattern the public recognized. A beloved mother, a family pleading for her safe return, investigators assuring the public that every lead was being examined carefully. But the atmosphere inside that courtroom suggested something different, something more complicated than the narrative people had been hearing outside.
I wanted to come on and say that we still have hope, and we still believe.
This isn't just a tragic disappearance anymore. This is becoming something that feels closer to a public unraveling. Because when Savannah Guthrie, the polished and composed face of the NBC Today show, walks away from the studio lights and into a courthouse hallway surrounded by cameras, you know the situation has shifted. Stories like this rarely stay simple once legal questions begin surfacing in open court.
I wanted to say to whoever has her or knows where she is that it's never too late. And
the question people were asking at the beginning of this investigation was straightforward. Where is Nancy Guthrie? Tonight, the question feels different. Now people are wondering what pieces of this story have not yet been fully explained. Stay with me for a moment, because what surfaced during that hearing didn't just add information. It introduced uncertainty. And uncertainty is where cases like this start to take unexpected turns.
Believe. And we believe in the essential goodness of every human being. And it's never too late.
The moment those courtroom doors closed, observers say the tone inside shifted almost immediately. This wasn't a quiet procedural update where attorneys read routine statements and everyone left with the same understanding they arrived with. This was a room filled with tension that even reporters watching from the back rows could feel. Savannah Guthrie walked in composed as always, posture straight, expression controlled. Years of live television have trained her to remain steady under pressure. But people inside that courtroom say the atmosphere around her was anything but calm. Just a few seats away sat her sister, eyes forward, expression tight, saying very little as the proceedings began.
Gotta go low. Came out with some bags, but it looked like food bags.
And in the center of everything was the name that had already been echoing through headlines for days. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, missing. For weeks, the public narrative had followed a familiar path. A disappearance, possible ransom communication, investigators carefully processing evidence.
They found DNA in the home area. They wouldn't say where it was, but obviously they believe it's suspicious.
A family speaking publicly about hope and determination. But inside that courtroom, new language started appearing. Language that reporters immediately recognized as significant. Attorneys began referencing procedural questions, evidence chain discussions, property-related findings connected to land that had already been searched earlier in the investigation. And suddenly the room felt noticeably quieter. Not because anyone was making accusations. No charges were announced. No direct allegations were stated in that moment. But in high-profile investigations, the way something is mentioned can carry just as much weight as what is being formally claimed. Observers say the discussion then turned toward items collected during one of the earlier search operations. Gloves, bagged materials, household objects that had been processed, cataloged, and transferred to forensic laboratories. Normally, that kind of evidence handling conversation would pass quietly through a courtroom. But one attorney raised a question that made several reporters glance at each other. The question wasn't about what had been collected. It was about when it had been officially logged, and whether the timing of that documentation aligned perfectly with statements previously given to the public. Alignment might sound like a routine legal term, but inside an investigation, every minute matters. The sequence of discovery, the moment an item is identified, the exact time it enters an evidence registry. Those details form the timeline investigators rely on when building a case. Outside the courthouse, reporters quickly began asking the same question viewers across the country were already typing online. Does this mean investigators suspect someone close to the situation? No direct accusation was made. Not in that room and not afterward. But public perception rarely waits for official clarification. Silence has a way of creating its own storyline. Within minutes, social media feeds were flooded with speculation. Video clips from earlier interviews were replayed. Facial expressions were analyzed frame by frame. Even small gestures suddenly carried meaning people had never considered before. And then something happened that pushed the tension even further. A brief reference surfaced to an additional communication connected to the case. Not the original message investigators had already confirmed weeks earlier. Another message. One that had not previously been discussed publicly. When reporters asked whether that communication included proof that Nancy Guthrie was alive at the time it was received, legal representatives declined to comment. That single word "declined" echoed far louder than any dramatic statement could have. Because in a case that had relied heavily on public appeals and emotional transparency, withholding information during a courtroom discussion instantly raised new questions. Why introduce the existence of another communication during a legal hearing instead of through a formal press update? Why avoid clarifying whether it indicated proof of life? And why did one federal representative quietly leave the building through a private corridor without speaking to the press waiting outside? None of these details prove anything on their own. Investigations often include moments of silence while evidence is being verified. But patterns are what investigators watch carefully. And patterns are exactly what observers began noticing that day. Inside the courtroom, one phrase reportedly echoed more than any other. Pending forensic clarification. Clarification of what exactly? The source of DNA, the handling of evidence, or something else entirely that has not yet been fully explained outside investigative circles. What began as a heartbreaking disappearance now feels like a complicated procedural chess match unfolding piece by piece. Every statement measured, every silence noticed, every new detail examined under a microscope. Savannah Guthrie has spent years asking difficult questions on national television. On this day, she sat inside a room where the questions were no longer hers to control. And that shift alone tells you something about where this story may be heading. Because when families begin addressing issues inside a courtroom instead of through cameras and prepared interviews, it usually means the situation has entered a very different stage. And whatever is beginning to surface now may only be the first layer of a story that is still unfolding in real time.
Let's talk about the cell phone towers. I know it casts a wide net, but how can they pinpoint a bad guy in this case?
Believe, and we believe in the essential goodness of people. And it is never too late for truth to surface. But just when the courtroom tension seemed like the highest point this case could reach, something else began happening quietly behind the scenes. Not official announcements, not carefully prepared press briefings, leaks, fragments of information circulating through reporters, legal observers, and people claiming to be close to the investigation. And those fragments suggested that what the public heard inside that courtroom might only represent a small portion of what investigators are actually examining. According to individuals familiar with early evidence reviews, Financial activity connected to properties associated with the family has begun attracting attention from investigators. No accusations. No criminal allegations. Just unusual patterns appearing in records that analysts typically review during complex investigations. Irregular transactions. Sudden account shifts. Consulting payments that appeared during the same window investigators now consider important. On paper, none of it proves anything, but investigators rarely ignore timing when it appears this precise. And timing in this case has started raising uncomfortable questions. Because during the same weeks Nancy Guthrie disappeared, certain expenses reportedly increased around properties tied to people close to the situation. Private security invoices, property maintenance contracts, consulting services that expanded abruptly. Each detail alone might look ordinary, but together they form a pattern investigators sometimes examine more closely. At the same time, another layer of investigation quietly expanded. Digital mapping. Not just simple phone records showing who called who. Investigators began studying device proximity data. That means identifying which mobile devices were physically near certain locations during very specific time frames. And this is where things start to sound less routine. Sources familiar with early digital mapping results claim investigators identified an unknown mobile device appearing near property connected to Savannah Guthrie's sister. The device was prepaid, not registered to a name, and it appeared repeatedly in the same general location days before the first official search teams arrived. Then the signal disappeared. That alone would be enough to interest investigators. But hours after the courtroom session ended, that same device reportedly appeared again on a network briefly before vanishing once more. No confirmed owner. No explanation. Just a signal lighting up and going dark again. When early hints of this information began spreading online, social media reacted instantly. People started pulling archived satellite images, neighborhood maps, old public records. Comment sections turned into debates about what the presence of an unidentified device might mean. Some argued it was meaningless background noise. Others believed it might represent someone watching events unfold in real time. And in the middle of all that speculation sits one simple reality. Investigators have not explained the device publicly. They have not confirmed who carried it. And they have not clarified why it appeared near that property more than once. Silence in investigations can mean many things. Sometimes it protects sensitive evidence. Sometimes it simply means analysts are still verifying data. But silence also creates room for interpretation. And interpretation spreads faster than facts once a case reaches this level of national attention. Which is why the story surrounding Nancy Guthrie now feels different from the moment it began. What started as a heartbreaking disappearance has slowly shifted into something that feels more complicated, more layered, and far more difficult to explain with a single simple answer. The question investigators continue asking is not only where Nancy Guthrie is. It is also whether every piece of the timeline surrounding her disappearance has been fully understood yet. And as investigators continued examining those timelines, another wave of discussion began spreading through legal circles and media offices. It started with something small, a document circulating privately among reporters, an alleged internal memo, unverified, unconfirmed, but widely discussed. The memo reportedly referenced ongoing analysis of narrative consistency surrounding the case. Narrative consistency is not a phrase typically associated with routine missing person investigations. It is language often used during crisis management reviews, situations where public messaging and factual developments must align precisely. And when analysts saw that phrase connected to this case, it immediately raised eyebrows. Meanwhile, observers began noticing subtle changes in how Savannah Guthrie appeared publicly. Her segments on the NBC Today show continued as usual, but some media analysts pointed out that her on-air appearances felt shorter, more controlled, more carefully structured. Mentions of the investigation itself became rare, sometimes avoided completely. In television news, the absence of discussion can sometimes be as meaningful as what is said openly. And media experts noticed that the story surrounding Nancy Guthrie was receiving coverage across networks while Savannah herself remained mostly silent about the courtroom developments. At the same time, investigators continued processing physical evidence collected during earlier searches. One item in particular continued drawing attention from analysts following the case closely: a glove recovered during evidence collection. Early discussions suggested possible DNA traces were found on that material, but results from forensic laboratories remain sealed. That leaves investigators asking several critical questions: whose DNA is present? When was the glove last handled? And whether that piece of evidence connects to the timeline surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Forensic testing rarely moves quickly in complex cases. Laboratories must verify results repeatedly before releasing conclusions publicly. But delays can also increase speculation when the case already has national attention. Meanwhile, federal investigators have neither confirmed nor denied whether the financial activity reports circulating among insiders are accurate. Agencies often avoid discussing ongoing reviews while evidence is still being analyzed. But when silence continues for long periods, the public often assumes something significant must be happening behind closed doors. And in the background, another factor has begun attracting attention: corporate concern. Because when a story involves one of the most recognizable faces in broadcast journalism, companies connected to that media environment inevitably start monitoring developments carefully. Advertising partners, network executives, and corporate risk teams routinely evaluate how major controversies might affect public perception. That does not mean anyone expects wrongdoing. It simply means reputational risk becomes part of the conversation when a national news figure becomes connected to an unfolding investigation. According to several industry observers, internal discussions inside media organizations have already begun focusing on one central question: what happens if the investigation surrounding Nancy Guthrie becomes more complicated than originally expected? Because media reputations are built slowly but can shift quickly once public trust becomes uncertain. Networks rely on stability, credibility, and viewer confidence. And any situation capable of disrupting that balance attracts attention at the highest levels of management. For now, there are no charges. No formal acusaciones. No official statements suggesting wrongdoing. But the number of questions surrounding the investigation continues growing. And every unanswered question increases the pressure surrounding this case.
In the general area of Nancy's home. And what's important about this is now you get to see what towers can law enforcement request.
As the investigation continues unfolding, public reaction has become sharply divided. Some people believe the Guthrie family is experiencing unfair scrutiny during a painful situation. Others argue that public transparency is essential whenever major questions remain unanswered. That divide has turned the case into something larger than a single missing person investigation. Online discussions now stretch across thousands of posts and videos. Amateur analysts examine property records. Digital hobbyists map cell tower coverage around the neighborhood where Nancy Guthrie lived. Every new theory attracts supporters and critics within minutes. Meanwhile, legal analysts have begun raising another possibility quietly in professional circles: the potential creation of a formal review panel. Not a criminal trial, not an indictment, simply an oversight review examining how information related to the investigation has been handled publicly. Review panels are sometimes created when high-profile cases involve complicated timelines or sensitive communications. Their purpose is usually to examine whether investigative procedures and public updates followed proper protocols. And the mere suggestion that such a review could occur indicates how seriously some observers are now taking the situation. Because once oversight agencies begin examining a case, the focus can shift beyond the original disappearance itself. Questions begin appearing about how information was released, who controlled public messaging, and whether every development was disclosed at the appropriate time. Political figures have even begun issuing carefully worded statements emphasizing the importance of maintaining public trust in federal investigations. None of those statements mention Nancy Guthrie directly, but anyone following the story closely understands the context at T. The same time, investigators continue examining digital mapping data from mobile networks surrounding the area where Nancy Guthrie lived. Cell towers from major providers record the presence of devices within certain distances. By analyzing overlapping tower signals, analysts can sometimes narrow the location of devices during particular moments. That technology does not immediately identify suspects, but it can reveal whether unfamiliar devices appeared in areas where investigators would not expect them. And that information becomes especially valuable when combined with surveillance footage, property access records, and witness timelines. Which brings the story back to the central mystery. An elderly woman disappears. Evidence is collected. Digital signals appear and vanish. Financial patterns draw quiet attention. And a family connected to national media suddenly finds itself surrounded by scrutiny it never anticipated. All of these elements now exist at the same time. None alone answers the most important question, but together they create a picture investigators are still trying to understand. And that is why this story continues tightening instead of fading, because every new layer introduces another question, another timeline, another piece of information waiting to be confirmed. For now, the official position remains unchanged. Nancy Guthrie is missing. The investigation remains active, and authorities continue asking anyone with information to come forward. But the deeper investigators look, the more complicated the picture appears becoming. And if cases like this have shown us anything over the years, it's that the truth rarely announces itself loudly. Most of the time it appears quietly, piece by piece, until suddenly the entire picture changes. If you want to follow every update the moment it surfaces, stay connected. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications because when the next development happens, you will want to hear it immediately.